The Pentagon tried to kill this airplane 3 times. Budget committees buried it, generals wrote it off, and yet right now as you watch this, it is the most feared long-range bomber on the planet. Tonight, we're going to find out exactly how a plane everyone wanted to retire became America's most lethal weapon, and why every enemy knows its name. It is 2:17 in the morning over the Arabian Sea inside the cockpit of a B-1B Lancer, a bomber so large it takes 4 crew members just to operate. There is almost no sound except the low relentless roar of 4 General Electric F-101 turbofan engines pushing 75,000 pounds of thrust through the dark. The pilot, Captain Dave Walton, has been airborne for 9 hours. His hands rest on a stick that controls a machine carrying more firepower than an entire naval destroyer. The radar screen in front of him shows clean, no threats, no alerts. The mission is routine. Then the radio crackles a single coordinate, a target that wasn't on the briefing sheet when they left Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota 14 hours earlier. The offensive systems officer, the man responsible for targeting, leans forward, types in the data, and says 4 words every B-1B crew trains for, but hopes to never hear on a cold night over open water. We have a hot tasking what happened next in a single mission over a single target is why this airplane refuses to die, and why the men who tried to kill it 3 times on paper were wrong every single time. But to understand why those men were wrong, you first have to meet the people who proved it. To understand the B-1B Lancer, the airplane crews affectionately call the bone, a phonetic nod to its designation, bone, you first have to understand the kind of pilot it takes to fly one. The bone requires 4 people to operate: a pilot, a co-pilot, an offensive systems officer who controls the weapons, and a defensive systems officer who watches for threats. These 4 human beings sit in a cockpit the size of a small van and manage a machine that can carry 75,000 pounds of weapons. That is more than the entire loaded weight of a World War II B-17 Flying Fortress. Major Brian Zach, a defensive systems officer who spent 12 years flying at Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, described what it felt like to sit at his station for the first time. You are not just flying an airplane, he said, you are a crew, 4 people. Every single one of you has to be right at the same time, under pressure, in the dark. That bond, that trust is what makes the bone work, and the men and women who fly it will tell you something the official briefings never mention. The B-1B does not inspire indifference. Every person who has ever strapped into one either loves it completely or spends years trying to explain why they left. Before we tell you what this airplane can do, type the word respect in the comments if you think the crews who kept this machine alive through 3 cancellations, 2 wars, and a decade of budget cuts deserve to be remembered, because what comes next is why they do. You have heard the bond. Now let me show you what that bond looked like when it mattered most, before we go back to where this story truly begins. On the night of March 24, 1999, the first night of Operation Allied Force NATO's air campaign over Serbia, a single B-1B crew flew deep into one of the most heavily defended airspace corridors in Europe at the time. They were not supposed to be there. The original plan called for cruise missiles and stealth aircraft. The B-1B was considered too old, too large, too visible, but the target required precision, volume, speed, and nothing else in the inventory that night could do all 3 at once. In a single mission, that crew delivered 24 precision-guided bombs on a single target. The target was gone before sunrise. Serbian air defense commanders, according to post-war intelligence assessments, had tracked the aircraft and could not intercept it. That crew was everything Brian Zach and Dave Walton had trained to become, and their story, the story of how an airplane like that got built at all, begins not in 1999, it begins in 1964, when the Air Force tried to create something that had never existed before, and the men in Washington tried to stop them before it ever left the ground. The story of the B-1B Lancer begins not with a triumph, but with a funeral. In 1964, the United States Air Force issued a requirement for a supersonic bomber that could fly low and fast under enemy radar deep into Soviet territory, a machine that could replace the aging B-52 Stratofortress, which had been in service since 1955. The result was the B-1A, a sleek, swept-wing aircraft capable of flying at Mach 22, more than twice the speed of sound, and carrying nuclear weapons across intercontinental distances without refueling. 4 prototypes were built. The engineers at Rockwell International spent years designing it, and then in 1977 President Jimmy Carter killed the entire program, not grounded it, not delayed it, canceled it completely. His reasoning was cold, and strategic cruise missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles ICBMs, the nuclear rockets that sit in silos underground, had made a manned penetrating bomber unnecessary. The B-1A, Carter argued, was an expensive relic of old thinking. Here is the detail that nobody ever talks about in the textbooks. When Carter canceled the B-1A, the 4 prototype aircraft kept flying. The Air Force continued test flights through 1981 on a program that had officially been declared dead. The engineers kept working, the data kept coming, and somewhere in the back rooms of the Pentagon people kept asking the same uncomfortable question: what happens if the cruise missiles are not enough? The answer came 4 years later when a new president walked into the Oval Office. Ronald Reagan had campaigned on Carter's cancellation of the B-1 as a symbol of American weakness on defense. In October 1981, less than 9 months after taking office, Reagan announced the B-1 program was being resurrected. But what came back was not the same airplane Carter had buried. The new version would be slower, half the top speed of the original Mach 12, instead of Mach 22. On paper, that sounds like a downgrade. But here is what they traded that speed for: more weapons than any bomber in American history, 74,000 pounds, more usable payload than the original design, a number so large it is almost abstract until you realize it means one airplane could carry what previously required an entire squadron, and a radar signature so reduced that by the time an enemy radar operator identified the contact, it was already past them, combined with a flight profile so low it could slip under radar coverage entirely. 3 deliberate trade-offs made the bone more dangerous than the plane it replaced. The B-1B Lancer was born on October 1st, 1986. According to official U.S. Air Force records, it achieved operational capability with the Strategic Air Command. 100 aircraft were delivered between 1986 and 1988. The United States had its bomber back. But here is what the program planners did not anticipate: within 3 years of the B-1B entering service, the entire reason it was built would vanish overnight. 1991, the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union dissolves, and with it the entire strategic purpose of the B-1B Lancer. The airplane had been designed to fly nuclear weapons into the heart of the Soviet Union. That mission was now gone. Worse, under the START I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed in July 1991, the B-1B's nuclear capability was formally stripped away. The bomb bays that had been designed to carry nuclear gravity bombs were converted for conventional weapons. The B-1B was no longer a nuclear bomber, it was just a very expensive, very complicated airplane with no clear mission. Inside the Air Force, serious voices began arguing it should be retired. The B-52, the very bomber the B-1B was supposed to replace, was still flying. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was entering development. What exactly was the B-1B for? The answer came on December 16, 1998. Operation Desert Fox: 4 days of airstrikes against Iraqi military infrastructure, targeting command centers, intelligence facilities, and weapons development sites, ordered by President Clinton in response to Saddam Hussein's refusal to cooperate with United Nations weapons inspectors. It was, according to official U.S. Air Force records, the B-1B Lancer's first combat deployment in its history. 12 years after entering service, the bone finally went to war. The results were immediate. The B-1B delivered precision strikes on high-value targets with a speed and payload that no other platform in the U.S. inventory could match. But it was the following year, the night we already told you about, that would define the airplane's legacy forever. April 1st, 1999, B-1B Lancers from Ellsworth Air Force Base, South Dakota, deploy to support Operation Allied Force, NATO's air campaign against Serbian forces in Kosovo. According to official U.S. Air Force figures, 6 B-1B aircraft participated in that campaign. Those 6 airplanes delivered more than 20% of the total ordnance dropped by all NATO forces combined, while flying less than 2% of the total combat sorties. 6 airplanes, 20% of all the bombs dropped, less than 2% of all the flights flown. Read that again. 1 B-1B was doing the work of roughly 10 aircraft of any other type. The airplane that had been declared obsolete, cancelled, resurrected, stripped of its nuclear mission, and left without a purpose had just proven it was the most efficient heavy bomber on the planet. Then came September 11, 2001, and everything changed again. When the United States military deployed to Afghanistan under Operation Enduring Freedom, the B-1B became, in the words of commanders on the ground, the aircraft they requested by name. Its combination of long loiter time, meaning it could circle overhead for hours waiting for a target, massive payload, and precision guidance systems, made it the ideal platform for close air support in mountainous terrain where ground troops were in contact with enemy forces. During the first 6 months of Operation Enduring Freedom, according to official Air Force records, 8 B-1B aircraft dropped nearly 40% of the total tonnage delivered by all coalition air forces combined. Those 8 airplanes released nearly 3,900 joint direct attack munitions, DAMs, precision GPS-guided bombs, representing 67% of all DAMs used in that entire 6-month campaign. In Operation Iraqi Freedom beginning in 2003, the numbers became almost impossible to believe. The B-1B flew less than 1% of all combat missions and delivered 43% of all the DAMs used. Here is the moment where everything you have just watched snaps into focus. The B-1B Lancer was never the problem. The problem was that nobody had given it the right mission. The airplane that was cancelled because cruise missiles made it unnecessary turned out to be the most precise, most efficient, most lethal conventional bomber in the history of American air power. It just needed a war to prove it. Now here is what the official record shows and what almost nobody talks about in the popular history of this airplane. The B-1B was supposed to retire when the B-21 Raider, America's next-generation stealth bomber, entered service. The plan was explicit. The Air Force began reducing the Lancer fleet, retiring airframes that had accumulated structural fatigue from years of low-level conventional combat flying. By 2021, the operational fleet had shrunk from the original 100 aircraft to approximately 45. But then something unexpected happened. The B-21 Raider began entering service, and the Air Force discovered a problem that no one had fully accounted for in the retirement planning. The B-21 is a stealth bomber optimized for penetrating heavily defended airspace. It is extraordinary at what it does, but it does not carry the same volume of weapons as the B-1B. It cannot match the Lancer's speed, and in a high-end conflict, the kind of large-scale conventional war that defense planners are now preparing for in the Pacific, the sheer payload capacity of the B-1B cannot be easily replaced by any aircraft currently in the American inventory. According to U.S. Air Force fact sheets and reporting by Air and Space Forces magazine, the B-1B holds the distinction of being the sole carrier of the long-range anti-ship missile, the LRASM, a precision weapon designed to destroy enemy warships from hundreds of miles away. In the United States Air Force, that single capability makes it a cornerstone of American strategy in the Indo-Pacific, where the threat of naval conflict has become the defining military concern of the 2020s. The airplane that was built to retire and then nearly retired 3 more times is now irreplaceable, not because the alternatives do not exist, but because nothing else does what it does at the volume it does it with the speed it does it. The B-1B Lancer's retirement has been delayed again. The bone soldiers on. The B-1B Lancer's story changed American military aviation in ways that are still unfolding today, and the most visible proof of that is not a weapon system or a regulation, it is a photograph. In August 2017, North Korea accelerated its ballistic missile testing program, launching multiple missiles over Japanese territory in a direct challenge to American regional deterrence. The United States military did not fire a single shot in response. Instead, 2 B-1B Lancers took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and flew directly up the eastern coast of North Korea, farther north than any U.S. military aircraft had flown along that coastline in the 21st century, accompanied by South Korean and Japanese fighter escorts. No bombs were dropped, none needed to be. The message was the airplane itself. North Korean state media went silent for 48 hours after the flight. American officials later confirmed the mission had been specifically selected because the B-1B, with its combination of speed, payload, and range, was the aircraft most most likely to be recognized and understood by the adversary it was meant to deter. That lesson one aircraft every mission became the foundation of every American combat aircraft that followed the F-35 exists in its current form because the B-1B proved the concept in real combat. Every time an F-35 pilot takes off from a carrier deck today, the B-1B's legacy is part of the reason that airplane was built the way it was. The B-1B Lancer was never just a machine. It was Major Brian Zach who spent 12 years flying it at Dyess Air Force Base and came back decades later for the 40th anniversary. Because some bonds do not break, it was Captain Dave Walton hands on the stick at 217 in the morning over the Arabian Sea, waiting on a coordinate that would send 4 people into harm's way before sunrise. It was the crew on the night of March 24, 1999, who flew into defended airspace in a plane everyone had called obsolete and came home having proved every one of those people wrong. It was the engineers at Rockwell International who kept testing a canceled airplane because they believed in it. It was the pilots in Kosovo who flew 6 aircraft and delivered 20% of NATO's ordnance while other commanders were still calculating how many sorties it would take. The B-1B was declared dead 3 times, and 3 times the people who flew it maintained it and believed in it brought it back. The airplane built to retire became the weapon no enemy wants to see on radar because of the men and women who refused to let it go. That is not a story about an airplane, that is a story about what happens when the people who understand something refuse to let the people who only see budget lines make the final call. Now I want to hear from you if you served at Ellsworth or Dyess, if you worked on the Bone, flew it, maintained it, or watched one take off in the middle of the night and wondered where it was going. Tell us your story in the comments below. There are people watching this right now who flew the missions we talked about tonight, and your words belong in this conversation. If you want to know what happens when the B-21 Raider finally takes over, and whether the Air Force is making the same mistake it made with the B-1A in 1977, that story is coming next. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. The Bone is not done yet, and neither are we.